When my wife leaned over my 83-year-old mother and said, "Go die somewhere else," she believed the old woman had no money, no leverage, and nowhere important to go. At 8:17 the next morning, my wife's chief executive called me in a panic. He did not ask whether Celeste was safe. He asked why an $18 million land deal had just collapsed under her name. People always ask whether I shouted when I heard the recording. I did not. I have spent 32 years estimating what pressure can do to concrete, steel, and human beings. Noise is what weak structures make before they fail. I became quiet instead because by then, I understood that my marriage was not cracking. It had already broken, and my mother had nearly been buried beneath it. My name is Grant Holloway. I am 56 years old, and until that Thursday night I believed I had built a respectable life in Wilmington, North Carolina. I owned half of a civil engineering company, lived in a restored cedar house near the Cape Fear River, and had been married to Celeste for 14 years. From the outside we looked polished, stable, and enviably successful. Celeste was 44 and served as vice president of land strategy for Alder Ridge Senior Living, a company that built expensive retirement communities along the East Coast. She could walk into a county meeting, remember every commissioner's spouse, and make a landowner feel brilliant for accepting less than a property was worth. She called it negotiation. My mother eventually called it hunting. Ruth Holloway had never been easy to impress. She was 83, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and still corrected newspaper grammar with a red pen. My father died 9 years earlier, leaving her alone in the white farmhouse where I grew up. She refused to sell it, refused assisted living, and refused every suggestion that age had made her incapable of deciding what happened to her own life. 3 months before everything happened, a pipe burst behind Ruth's kitchen wall while she was visiting her sister. Water ruined the flooring cabinets and electrical system. Repairs would take 10 weeks. I offered her our guest suite immediately. Celeste smiled and said the right words, but the smile vanished before Ruth had carried in her second suitcase. I noticed. I chose not to understand. At first, the trouble looked ordinary. Celeste complained that Ruth woke too early, folded towels incorrectly, and left teacups near the sunroom window. Ruth complained that Celeste threw away food after one day and spoke to housekeepers as if kindness were an optional expense. I treated both women like weather systems. I adjusted my route and told myself the storms would pass. Then Celeste began telling me Ruth was confused. She said my mother repeated stories, misplaced papers, and accused people of moving her things. I asked Ruth about it once. She stared at me for a long moment and said, "Your wife keeps entering my room when I am not there." I should have believed her. Instead, I asked whether she might have forgotten locking the door. That answer still embarrasses me. Ruth had raised me through layoffs, hurricanes, and my father's long illness. She had never invented fear to attract attention. Yet one polished sentence from my wife carried more weight than 83 years of my mother's character. That is how betrayal often begins, not with cruelty but with a reasonable man choosing the explanation that requires the least courage. The land at the center of everything was called Willow Bend. 14 acres of pine marsh grass and high ground sat behind Ruth's farmhouse, bordering a new bypass. My father bought it cheaply in 1987 because everyone thought the soil was useless. 30 years later, developers saw highway access, municipal water, and enough elevation to build something enormous. What Celeste did not fully understand was that Ruth did not own Willow Bend personally anymore. After my father died, she placed the land inside the Holloway Heritage Trust. I was the trustee. Ruth held lifetime control, and neither of us could transfer the property without the other. The arrangement was private. Celeste knew there was paperwork, but she assumed it was a simple inheritance plan. Alder Ridge wanted Willow Bend for its newest luxury campus. Their preliminary design included villas, a private clinic, 2 restaurants, and a memory care wing, with a monthly price higher than most local families earned in half a year. Celeste had spent months assembling nearby parcels. Willow Bend was the final piece. Without it, the entrance road could not meet state requirements. She never told me her promotion depended on acquiring it. She never told me the board had tied a $300,000 performance bonus to closing the site. She certainly never told me she had described Ruth in internal reports as cognitively declining, financially unsophisticated, and likely to accept family-guided terms. I learned those words later. Every one of them felt like a hand around my throat. The week before the confrontation, I left for Raleigh to inspect foundation failures at a municipal project. Celeste knew I would be gone for 3 nights. Ruth knew only that I was working. On Wednesday evening, she called and asked when I would return. Her voice sounded careful, which was unusual. I said Friday afternoon. She said, "All right, darling," and changed the subject. My inspection ended a day early because the city shut the site after a thunderstorm warning. I considered staying at the hotel, but something about Ruth's call bothered me. I packed at noon Thursday and drove home through heavy rain. I did not tell Celeste. I imagined surprising them with takeout from Ruth's favorite seafood place. That small decision changed the rest of my life. When I turned onto our street, I saw Ruth sitting on our neighbor's covered porch. She wore her navy church coat over a nightgown. One slipper was missing. A small suitcase stood beside her, open at the zipper, with 2 blouses hanging out into the rain. Mrs. Alvarez had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and was speaking into a phone. I ran across the wet lawn. Mrs. Alvarez said Ruth had knocked on her door 20 minutes earlier, shaking and short of breath. She had a red mark around one wrist. Her blood pressure was dangerously high. An ambulance was already coming. Ruth kept saying she did not want trouble. I knelt in front of her and asked what happened. She looked toward my house before answering. "Celeste wanted me to sign something," she said. "I told her I would wait for you. She said waiting would cost her everything." Ruth swallowed. Then she took my document box. When I tried to stop her, she dragged my suitcase outside and told me to go die somewhere else. For 1 second, I could not hear the rain. I could see Celeste through our front window walking across the living room with a glass of wine, calm as a person finishing an ordinary evening. That image did something to me. Anger rose first, hot and useless. Then training took over. Secure the vulnerable person. Preserve evidence. Do not contaminate the scene. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Ruth's blood pressure was 214 over 108. They warned that stress at her age could trigger a stroke. I climbed into the ambulance with her and called Mrs. Alvarez from the back seat. I asked whether her porch camera recorded audio. She said yes. I asked her to save everything from the last hour and send it only to me. At the emergency department, Ruth underwent tests for nearly 3 hours. No stroke, no heart attack. Severe hypertensive episode, bruising on her wrist, and mild hypothermia from sitting outside in wet clothes. The doctor wanted her observed overnight. I sat beside her bed while she apologized for causing problems. Every apology made my shame heavier because the problem had never been her. At 1:40 p.m., Mrs. Alvarez sent the video. I watched it once with the sound low. Then I watched it again with headphones. Celeste's voice carried clearly through the rain. She accused Ruth of sabotaging her career, called her selfish, and said no one would believe a confused old woman. Then came the sentence from the title, cold and unmistakable. The video showed more than words. It showed Celeste wrenching the brass document box from Ruth's hands. It showed her gripping Ruth's wrist, opening the front door and pushing the suitcase across the threshold. Ruth was not physically thrown, but at 83 in a storm, wearing one slipper, the difference was moral bookkeeping. Celeste had placed her outside knowing exactly what could happen. Ruth fell asleep shortly after midnight. I kissed her forehead and drove home. The rain had slowed to a fine mist. Every window in my house was lit. Celeste sat in the kitchen with her laptop open and a folder beside it. The brass document box rested on the counter. She had not even bothered to hide what she had taken. She stood when I entered. "Grant, thank God. Your mother had some kind of episode." She spoke quickly, already arranging the story. She became aggressive, grabbed me, and ran outside. I tried to stop her, but she was completely irrational. "I think we need to discuss long-term care before she becomes dangerous to herself or us." I placed my phone on the table and played the recording without saying a word. Celeste's face changed at the first sentence. By the time her own voice said, "Go die somewhere else," she had lowered herself into a chair. She did not apologize. She asked where I got the video. That question told me more than any confession could have. "Open the folder," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar, almost gentle. Celeste folded her arms and told me I was overreacting. I repeated myself. She opened it. Inside were a purchase agreement, a medical capacity affidavit, and a letter authorizing Alder Ridge to negotiate on Ruth's behalf. The signature at the bottom of the letter was supposed to be mine. It was not mine. It looked close enough to survive a hurried glance, but she had formed the capital G the way I signed birthday cards, not legal documents. She had copied the wrong version of me. Under the signature was a statement declaring Ruth unable to manage complex financial matters. The attached witness certification carried the name of a junior employee from Celeste's department. I asked how long she had been planning it. She said I did not understand the pressure she was under. Alder Ridge had invested millions in surrounding parcels. The board expected results. Ruth was being unreasonable about land she did not use. Celeste said the project would employ hundreds and provide beautiful care for seniors. She made fraud sound like public service. Then she said something that ended whatever remained between us. Your mother was going to die before she ever did anything useful with that property. She said it with frustration, not malice, as if Ruth's continued existence were an administrative delay. I looked at the woman I had slept beside for 14 years and realized I had mistaken ambition for strength. I told Celeste to pack a bag and leave. She laughed once sharply because she thought the house belonged to both of us in the uncomplicated way married people assume houses do. It did not. I had purchased it before our marriage and kept it separate under our agreement. She knew that. She had simply never imagined the distinction would matter. She refused until I called the police non-emergency line and reported that an elderly resident had been removed from the home, assaulted and deprived of documents. I said evidence was preserved. Celeste stared at me while I spoke. 10 minutes later, she carried 2 suitcases to her car. Before leaving, she warned that I was destroying our marriage over one ugly argument. No, I told her. I am ending the part where you decide my mother's life is negotiable. She drove away at 1:26 a.m. I locked the door, photographed every document, and placed the originals inside a fireproof safe. Then I sat alone at the kitchen table and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to grieve the marriage I thought I had. After that, I went to work. Not revenge in the theatrical sense. No broken windows, no screaming voicemail, no public spectacle. I began with the trust attorney Miriam Shaw, who answered on the emergency number because she had represented my parents for 20 years. I explained the forged signature, the attempted acquisition, and the assault. Her first instruction was simple: touch nothing else and send everything. At 3:08 a.m., Miriam filed an electronic notice freezing any transaction involving Willow Bend. At 3:40, she sent a preservation demand to Alder Ridge's general counsel, requiring the company to retain every email draft, text, and recorded call connected to the property. At 4:15, she contacted the notary whose seal appeared on the capacity affidavit. The notary said she had never met Ruth. At 6:30, I called my business partner and took indefinite leave. At 7:00, I arranged private nursing support for Ruth's first week home. At 7:20, a locksmith changed every exterior code. At 7:45, Mrs. Alvarez delivered Ruth's missing slipper in a grocery bag. She hugged me in the doorway and said, "Your mother kept asking whether you would believe her." That sentence hurt more than the recording. Ruth had not feared death first. She had feared being dismissed. I thanked Mrs. Alvarez, closed the door, and stood in the foyer looking at the staircase where my mother had lived like a guest under suspicion. I promised myself she would never again have to prove pain before receiving protection from me. At 8:17, my phone rang. The caller ID read Warren Pike, Chief Executive Officer of Alder Ridge Senior Living. I had met him twice at civic events but had never given him my personal number. His voice was controlled, though not calm. "Mr. Holloway, our legal department received a notice involving Willow Bend. I need to verify whether you withdrew authorization." "I never gave authorization," I said. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence. The kind that happens when a man realizes the floor beneath his office may not be structural. Warren asked whether I had signed a letter dated 12 days earlier. I told him the signature was forged. He asked whether Ruth had been found mentally incompetent. I told him she had balanced her own checkbook that morning before being thrown into a storm. Warren did not defend Celeste. He asked for evidence. I sent the porch recording photographs of the documents, Ruth's recent cognitive assessment, and the notary's written denial. Then I asked him one question: "What exactly did my wife tell your board?" He exhaled slowly and said, "That your mother wanted the sale, but you were emotionally incapable of discussing her decline." Celeste had constructed a complete alternate family. In her version, Ruth was confused, I was sentimental, and she alone was brave enough to act. Warren admitted the board had approved preliminary financing based on her reports. She had also represented that the Holloway Trust would sign within 48 hours. If the deal closed, she would become regional president. Then Warren told me something Celeste had hidden even more carefully. Alder Ridge had already spent nearly $2 million securing options on neighboring land. Those options expired in 6 weeks. Without Willow Bend's access corridor, the entire project became landlocked. Celeste had not merely chased a bonus. She had gambled the company's expansion budget on forcing an old woman to cooperate. Warren said an emergency board meeting would begin at 10. He asked whether Ruth and I would join by video. I told him Ruth was in the hospital and would decide for herself. Then I drove back to the medical center with fresh clothes, her red reading glasses, and the truth I should have carried to her months earlier. I believed her completely. Ruth listened without interrupting while I explained the forged documents, the board meeting, and Celeste's lies. When I finished, she looked toward the hospital window. Morning sun was breaking through the clouds. I wondered why she suddenly cared so much about my memory, she said. There was no triumph in her voice, only exhaustion and the sadness of someone whose suspicions had finally become facts. I apologized. Not the weak kind that asks forgiveness before naming the harm. I told her I had treated her age as evidence against her. I had allowed Celeste to make every disagreement sound like decline. I had protected convenience instead of protecting my mother. Ruth reached for my hand, but she did not release me from responsibility. Then do better now, she said. At 9:50, a nurse helped Ruth sit upright. Miriam joined from her office. Warren appeared on the screen with Alder Ridge's General Counsel, Human Resources Director, and 4 board members. Celeste joined from a hotel room. She wore a navy suit, full makeup, and the expression she used when entering negotiations she expected to win. Then she saw Ruth beside me. Celeste began by calling the incident a private misunderstanding. She claimed Ruth became disoriented during a conversation about emergency planning. She said the video lacked context and accused me of weaponizing a marital dispute. For 3 minutes she spoke without pausing. It was impressive in the way a controlled demolition is impressive when you forget people may be inside the building. Warren let her finish. Then the general counsel shared the forged letter on screen and asked who prepared it. Celeste said a staff member must have uploaded the wrong draft. The junior employee whose name appeared as witness was already on another line. She stated that Celeste ordered her to sign a blank certification and threatened her job when she hesitated. The notary joined next. She confirmed her seal number had been copied from an unrelated document. Then Miriam displayed metadata, showing the files were created on Celeste's company laptop at 1:14 p.m., 3 weeks earlier. Celeste's face remained composed, but her right hand disappeared beneath the desk. I knew that habit. She was digging her nails into her palm. Finally, Warren played the porch recording. No one spoke while Celeste's voice filled the meeting. You are standing between me and my future. Then Ruth's reply, your future cannot require my signature. Then the sound of the suitcase scraping across concrete. Then those 6 words, go die somewhere else then. They sounded even worse in a room built for accountability. Celeste tried one final defense. She said Ruth had provoked her, that caregiving stress had pushed her beyond control, and that I had abandoned her to manage an impossible situation. Ruth leaned toward the camera. Her hospital bracelet slid down her wrist. You were never my caregiver, she said. You were waiting for me to become paperwork. The board asked Ruth whether she intended to sell Willow Bend. She looked at me first, not for permission, but because the trust required both voices. Then she told them the truth Celeste had never bothered to discover. For 8 months, Ruth and I had been discussing a donation to Harbor Home, a nonprofit building affordable housing for widowed seniors and disabled veterans. Willow Bend was not going to become a gated luxury campus. Ruth wanted small cottages, a community clinic, gardens, and rents tied to income. My father had served in the Navy and spent his final years worrying that surviving spouses were being priced out of the county. The land was meant to become something he would recognize as honorable. Celeste's expression finally broke. Not when the forgery appeared. Not when the employee testified. It broke when she understood there would be no transaction to rescue, no renegotiation, no bonus delayed by family drama. The land she had treated as a dead woman's obstacle had already been promised to people who could never afford the community she was selling. Warren muted Celeste and asked Ruth whether Alder Ridge could submit a different proposal under independent review. Ruth declined politely. Then Warren informed Celeste that she was suspended, immediately barred from company systems, and subject to an external investigation. He also said Alder Ridge would refer the forged documents to state authorities and cooperate fully with any elder abuse inquiry. The call ended at 1038. Ruth removed her glasses and closed her eyes. I expected relief. Instead, she cried quietly for less than a minute. She had liked Celeste once. She had defended my marriage to relatives who thought my wife was too ambitious and too sharp. Betrayal hurts deepest when it proves kindness was extended to someone who studied it only for leverage. I sat beside her until the tears stopped. Then Ruth said I do not want her destroyed. I told her Celeste had made choices with consequences. Ruth nodded. Consequences are not destruction. But do not become cruel just because she was. That was my mother. Even from a hospital bed, she was reminding me that justice and appetite are not the same thing. Celeste called 47 times before noon. I answered once. She was crying hard enough that words arrived broken. She said Warren had ruined her career, the company had locked her out, and police wanted an interview. She begged me to tell everyone Ruth was confused. Even then, she was not asking whether Ruth was safe. She was asking me to help finish the lie. I told her I had filed for legal separation and that all communication would go through attorneys. She said 14 years should mean more than one terrible night. I answered that 14 years were exactly why the night mattered. It revealed what she had been willing to do after learning every weakness in my family and every excuse I was likely to accept. Ruth came home 2 days later, not to my guest suite but to the primary bedroom overlooking the river. She protested until I reminded her the room had the safest bathroom and widest doorway. I moved into the downstairs office. A nurse visited each morning. Mrs. Alvarez brought soup. My business partner installed a handrail without charging me and became offended when I offered. For the first week, Ruth woke whenever a car door closed outside. She kept the brass document box beside her bed even after Miriam replaced every paper inside. Trauma does not care that the locks have changed. It waits for footsteps. I began sitting with her at night, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply proving that no one would enter without permission. The investigation moved faster than Celeste expected. Alder Ridge found emails in which she described Ruth as the final resistance point and promised the board she could neutralize the family issue. Investigators also found a draft message instructing the junior employee to backdate the witness form. Celeste had deleted it. The company server had not forgotten. 3 weeks later, Warren visited Ruth in person. He arrived without lawyers, carrying flowers and a written apology from the board. Ruth accepted the apology but not the flowers. She told him to give them to the nurses who had cared for her. Warren looked embarrassed when she asked why a company serving elderly people rewarded executives for treating seniors as obstacles to inventory. That question changed more than Celeste's employment. Alder Ridge paused the entire project and commissioned an ethics review of its acquisition practices. Warren later told me 2 other landowners had reported similar pressure from Celeste's team. Their complaints had been categorized as difficult negotiations. Once again, older people had been treated as unreliable because reliability would have been inconvenient. Celeste was terminated for cause. Her performance bonus disappeared, her promotion vanished, and the company demanded repayment of certain expenses tied to the fraudulent acquisition. The district attorney charged her with attempted fraud, document forgery, and misdemeanor elder mistreatment. Months later, she accepted a plea requiring probation, community service, restitution, and no direct contact with Ruth. The divorce became final the following spring. Celeste fought hardest over the house, then over my company, shares, then over reputation. Our agreement protected most premarital property, and her criminal case weakened every argument about my supposed cruelty. In the end, she received what the law required and nothing purchased by intimidating my mother. That distinction mattered to me. Once during mediation, Celeste asked to speak privately. My attorney advised against it, but I agreed with the door open. She looked smaller without the office title and tailored armor. She said I became someone I do not recognize. I told her the problem was not that she failed to recognize herself. The problem was that Ruth recognized her early, and I refused to listen. She asked whether I had ever loved her. I said yes. Then she asked whether I still did. I told her love was no longer the question. Safety was. Trust was. Whether my mother could sleep without a suitcase packed was. Celeste cried, but I did not rescue her from the answer. For years, rescue had been the language that kept consequences away. Willow Bend transferred to Harbor Home 11 months after the storm. Ruth signed the final donation papers at a folding table beneath the largest pine tree on the property. Miriam stood beside her. I signed as trustee. A group of veterans, widows, nurses, and local volunteers watched. No champagne, no photographers hired by a corporation, no sales presentation. Ruth moved back to her farmhouse after repairs were completed, but only after I installed cameras, railings, emergency sensors, and a refrigerator that texted me when the door stayed open. She complained about every device and secretly showed them off to visitors. I ate dinner with her 4 nights a week. On Sundays, she corrected my grammar and pretended not to enjoy winning. Our relationship changed, not because I became a better son overnight, but because I stopped confusing love with assumption. I asked before deciding. I listened before explaining. When Ruth said something felt wrong, I no longer searched for the version that preserved my comfort. Trust is not believing people only when their evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Trust begins earlier. A year after the storm, Warren called me again at 8:17 inches the morning. For 1 second, my body remembered the first call. This time, he said Harbor Homes' entrance permit had been approved. The road would break ground Monday. He thanked Ruth for forcing his company to examine itself. I told him she would dislike being called a force. Then I admitted she was one. That afternoon, I drove Ruth to Willow Bend. Survey flags fluttered along the future road. She stood where the community kitchen would rise and looked across the pines. Your father would have complained about the traffic, she said. I laughed. He would have designed a better entrance. She nodded. Then make sure you do. Some expectations are a burden. Hers became a compass. People still tell me I acted too harshly toward Celeste. They say careers should not end over family conflict, marriages should survive ugly words, and elderly parents can be difficult. Maybe all 3 statements are sometimes true. None of them mattered in our case. Celeste did not lose everything because of one sentence. The sentence simply opened the door to everything she had hidden behind it. My mother is 84 now. She drinks tea on her farmhouse porch and watches cottages rise on land Celeste believed was waiting for death. Every time I visit, the brass document box sits on a shelf in plain view. Ruth no longer keeps it beside her bed. That is how I measure the ending, not by what my former wife lost, but by what my mother no longer fears. The morning after Celeste told Ruth to die somewhere else, her boss called me because a deal was collapsing. What he did not understand yet was that the deal had never been the real structure in danger. My marriage was. My judgment was. My mother's faith in me was. One deserved to fall. The other 2 had to be rebuilt carefully, honestly, and without excuses. I used to think protecting a family meant preventing conflict. Now I know better. Sometimes protection sounds like a locked door. Sometimes it looks like a preserved recording, a lawyer answering before dawn, or a son finally admitting he chose comfort over truth. And sometimes the strongest thing a man can say is not a threat. It is simply, I believe you. It will not happen again.